introduction about the MEL Sandbox for those who might not have joined before. So the Sandbox was set up in 2023 by the UNDP, and essentially to nurture and to learn from new ways of doing monitoring and evaluation and learning that are coherent with the complex nature of the challenges that we're facing today. So in the Sandbox, we've always taken a position of prioritizing practical insights and action, and really wanting to hear from voices on the front line. So the people doing the MEL in these complex situations, maybe sometimes working on systemic change or working on efforts that are looking at systems change. And so we convene this series throughout the year. And at the moment, we've got a particular focus on learning partnerships, and my colleague Sue is going to tell you a little bit more about this series and also the session today. And in each session, what we do is we invite practitioners like yourselves to come in and share their practice with us. And then we invite participants, obviously, to share questions and comments and resources in the chat. So as you listen to the presentations, please take some time, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A function. If you have any resources that you think are relevant or could be relevant to people in the community that are attending the Sandbox, please drop those in the comments as well. And any comments you'd like to make or any interactions you'd like to have with other participants on the call, please do so throughout this hour. And it is just an hour today. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sue to tell you more about today's session.
Thank you, Zazie. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So as Zazie mentioned, we are putting together a series of sessions to explore the evolving landscape of learning partnerships in the systems and complexity space. Over the next 2 or 3 sessions, we want to understand what is driving the uptick in learning partnerships, what forms does a learning partnership take, how are they set up, and identify their role in helping teams and organizations grapple with complex systems. Over the course of these sessions, we'll be guided by framing questions like, what are the enabling conditions for successful learning partnerships? What tangible outcomes do learning partnerships facilitate? And how learning can be effectively integrated into evidence through hopefully easy to hack practical processes. So for today's session, we have brought together colleagues supporting a learning community of practice and colleagues working with numerous international organizations to develop accessible and actionable learning. We'll also have 2 additional presenters for the Q&A session. Our first presentation is from Morag Mwenya Neill-Johnson from the Center for Public Impact. Morag is a global development practitioner with over a decade of experience advancing social innovation in international development. Morag led both the equity and innovation and the systems innovation portfolios for the Secretariat of the International Development Innovation Alliance. Morag. Supporting a learning network of funders and implementers to rethink the role of innovation in development. She now co-leads CPI's collective at the Center for Public Impact, a systems transformation lab focused on peer learning, experimentation, and exchange. So today, Morag is going to share about CPI's exploration with learning in community and CPI's transition from learning support to learning partner. Welcome, Morag.
Thank you so much, Sue, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us to share just a little bit about CPI's collective. I'm going to be joined by my colleague Javiera, who you'll probably see in one of the boxes on your screen during the Q&A. But as Sue has already mentioned, my name is Morag. I am a senior program manager at the Center for Public Impact. And we work on the Global Development Initiative within CPI. And this is where we explore the integration of our organization's approach to learning in complexity to address challenges that persist globally. And so institutionally, we actually refer to ourselves as a learning partner. And this typically takes place at an intervention level. So we support specific projects, cities, programs using action learning and sense making and a range of other methodologies to meet the learning goals of our partner. So as we think about the range of what it means to be a learning partner, this role actually looks a lot like more of a learning support, where the learning takes place alongside the delivery of programmatic work. And we find that as a learning partner in this capacity, the ambition of learning and adaptation is often confined by each intervention and partner that we engage. So, that said, we've also seen, as Sue mentioned, that there's a growing appetite to centralize learning in the architecture of programmatic work. So this is what we call adopting learning as a management strategy. So for example, we've seen that there's an increase of grant programs that have been designed with a learning partner role included to deepen learning within and across a portfolio of funded initiatives. So a learning partner in this capacity is almost seen as a neutral party, which is positioned to support in better understanding how a group of interventions collectively influence a complex challenge. And although one might argue, or I might argue, whether neutrality is actually achievable in this capacity, the learning partner role is necessary in part to counter that power differential between those who fund and those who are receiving funds to deliver an intervention. But today, I'm actually going to speak about CPI's collective, as you see on the screen. And despite this trend that I've just mentioned, my team at CPI were really curious about developing learning collaboratives that go beyond specific interventions or grant programs by building systems communities of practice that focus on learning through collaboratively designing and testing new approaches to address a specific challenge. When we think about challenge within the collective, we think of this in terms of a development function or relevant topics that are organized regionally or at a sector level. And we were really curious about what it looks like to facilitate collaboration in these spaces, which I should say that we've started to describe as systemic collaboration. And I think my colleague's going to add something in the chat and you can take a look more at systemic collaboration there. But the idea is to really tackle the root causes of these complex interconnected challenges. We are also curious about the role of experimentation and what that plays in order to facilitate collaborative learning within these systems communities of practice. So we built and launched CPI's collective in September of 2024. And by design, this started off as a 4-month journey, which we've since extended to a year-long program. And this is 20+ participants who meet twice a month for about 90 minutes. And we go through a tailored learning and experimentation journey. We started this process with 2 pilot communities of practice, and that was the practice of decolonizing development, and then the second, the practice of measuring systems change. Recruitment for these 2 pilots was really an open call across CPI's network, inviting a diversity of actors and perspectives to experiment and sense make together. And alongside our pilot COPs, we also began developing regionally based cohorts looking at first Innovation for Democracy in Latin America, which launched in November 2024. We are also currently scoping a climate governance cohort, which will also be primarily based around Latin America. And we will touch a little bit more on each of these cohorts in a little bit. But that is a very high-level overview, which we're happy to dig into more detail about the actual design and architecture of the collective. But I do want to touch on 3 main insights today. And this is really just from our learning from launching our pilots back in 2024. And the first insight is that trust is foundational to developing an experimentation and learning-oriented community of practice. And without that focus on the relational component of this work, we found that reaching the level of collaboration and experimentation required to develop new pathways and approaches is really challenging to accomplish. So we've adopted a very co-creative process with participants in the practice, in the community of practice, using a community weaving framework. And we continue to return to this resource as needed and as we deepen that relational component of the work. So it must also be noted, though, that this is not the only framework that we've borrowed from. The theory behind our community of practice integrates a multitude of complexity and learning approaches without becoming beholden to any single approach. So, for example, we've also looked at the systems innovation initiatives, 4 Keys to Unlock Systems, the Bekana 2 Loops model, which I know everyone, at least I love so much. But we also brought in key collaborators whose work we found were really complementary to ours, such as the Caravanserai Collective and their intensive training on public narrative. So moving at the speed of trust, as you see on the screen, really meant that we had to slow down quite a bit. And what we thought we could accomplish in 4 months was really just enough time to start building the trust within the community of practice in order to then test approaches together. So we have extended the timeline of our pilot communities of practice to allow for greater room for that experimentation, which includes matching needs to expertise, developing opportunity for collaboration, designing additional technical modules, and so forth. So during the experimentation phase, which is what we're calling this extension of the pilot, we've adapted our cadence to meet every 6 weeks in order to sense make across those experiments and really gather the learning for the group. My second insight that I would like to share is around the complexity of the who as we're bringing together these systems communities of practice. So as I mentioned, the recruitment for our pilot was through an open call, and our assumption was that a diverse cohort would really be beneficial to build and test new approaches together, different perspectives all coming together. And that worked quite well for the decolonizing development group. But what we found is that with certain topics, a more tailored process of building the community of practice was really needed to ensure coherence across the cohort and essentially level set our starting point together. So the Measuring Systems Change pilot was filled with an array of people at different levels of exposure to the topic, as well as a diversity of positions across the organization and across sectors. And what we found is with such a divergence of experiences, determining who to center in the community of practice actually became quite challenging. Do we build the technical content to meet the needs of those who are newer to the topic area? Or do we build the content to those who are most advanced in order to actually maintain relevance to them? So one of the changes that we're going to adopt moving forward for a next iteration of the Measuring Systems Change cohort would be to rather focus on M&E officers, for example, who hold similar experiences and similar challenges in their work. Another component that we're thinking about in terms of the who is the benefits and drawbacks to participation at an individual level versus an institutional level. So institutional representation allows for a level of buy-in, which we find is quite helpful when we get to that testing and embedding phase of new approaches, right? We're able to do so at an organizational level. So again, if I just go back to the Measuring Systems Change example, we're really questioning to what extent do M&E officers have decision-making power to test new approaches in their institutions? Do we get around this by, setting up a prerequisite that each participant comes in with an idea or a project that they can actually work on and test around? As an alternative, if you're coming in as an individual, what space do you have to test? Have you already identified that opportunity? So this is of particular interest to us, especially as we think about what it means to embed our work and what comes out of the community practice at the end of that year-long journey. So how do we hold the complexity of that while still acknowledging that not all institutions are actually poised for change? I just want to mention another example of a different form of engagement that we've been thinking about. And as I mentioned, we are scoping a climate governance cohort, and we're really going through an in-depth process with our co-host organization, Results for Development. And what we've identified is it's really important for us to amplify the work that's already being done in the space of climate justice. And so where are the other networks and how can we be complementary to them through this process? So we are trying to define what an ideal participant for the systems community of practice would be, getting as close to those who are impacted by the challenges or this challenge or those who are working closest to climate justice. But at the same time, we're exploring what other roles are actually needed in the cohort that engage the wider climate justice ecosystem. So do we bring in, for example, coaches or supporters of experiments, network connectors, technical advisors, right? So we really needed to build out the full role or roles within the community of practice beyond just the participant. I'll also say that this is really important because we find that engaging decision makers, because this is about enacting change and not just coming together to learn and test with each other, right? But how does this actually translate to change? It really does require us to bring in those decision makers. Okay, there's a lot on the who, obviously, but I'm going to move on to our final insight for today, which is the discomfort of emergence. And our communities of practice are co-developed, not just at the outset, but really throughout the entire year-long journey. So we adopt what we call an emergent learning approach. And so this is learning that emerges or arises organically in unpredictability. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in emergence. And even without those external pressures that you might typically find at intervention level learning, such as your partner, the funder, and so forth, we still found it was really easy to fall back to our old habits of control, being risk averse. And so as a team, we've had to really check ourselves around the things that we're really trying to challenge in this systems community of practice. We found that in adopting emergence, learning at the topical level of the actual community of practice is deepened when we actually engage other levels of learning as well. So how are we learning at an individual level? How are we learning what it takes to collaborate differently with one another in the cohort? How are we learning about what it actually takes to enact change in complexity in addition to the actual topic that we're gathered around? So again, I can talk at length about this, but I want to leave you with a quote from one of our participants who is based in Uganda and who has beautifully described this relationship of different scales of learning across both his personal journey being a part of the community of practice as well as in conducting his experiment. And Abdul's experiment is based in Chuatule in Kampala. And he's really interested in looking at how to what the enabling conditions are in order to align landowners towards stewarding ecological, social, and economic health in their land and community. And so he's developed what he calls Ubuntu credits. And this is a context-specific alternative to carbon credits. And Abdul says that it dawned on me how deeply ingrained in us it is to give little value to intangible efforts like trust building. Our instincts have been conditioned to go direct to the doing or the function and skip or undervalue the being part, which makes me wonder how to nurture this in others we work with in a way that helps them to see the value in starting with the being. In my case, landowners who want to see things move fast. And so I leave you with this because I feel it really captures the contradictions that we're constantly designing for and around in our systems communities of practice, and how deeply confrontational all of this is, I think, in our professional journeys as well as collectively. But it has been quite rewarding so far. So I will leave you with that and happy to go into more detail during the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Morag. That was very interesting. I love that last quote. And I really enjoyed some of the points you made about the power differentials and how you're managing that through the collaborative as well, and this learning at different levels, which is where you can often get lost, right? Like, what are we actually doing, and are we just navel gazing, or are we actually learning something that can also be acted upon? And of course, across those different levels. So our next presentation, we are joined by Robbie Gregorowski. Robbie is an evaluation expert with 20 years experience designing, managing, and delivering numerous headline evaluations and wider MEL support to a range of international organizations. Robbie founded Sophoi and pioneered its innovative approach called ESLA Loops, which integrates evaluative evidence with stakeholder experience and insights for adaptive learning on complex challenges. This emphasizes the value of stakeholder participation in the sense-making process as much as the evaluation product. And so over to you, Robbie, where you're going to be telling us more about how learning can be effectively integrated into the evidence base and implemented through user-friendly processes. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Let me just check that my screen share is working. What are you seeing? You're seeing my whole presentation.
Thanks, Robbie. We see also the other slides. Maybe you can click on presenting, please. Presentation mode.
I thought I was in presentation mode. Maybe we go to our backup and you present for me. I'll stop sharing.
Sounds great. Give me one moment.
The first thing I wanted to say is, and it's to throw it out there to everybody as a question, but I'm increasingly uncomfortable with calling myself a MEL expert. And I increasingly try to call myself something along the lines of evidence, sense-making and learning facilitator. So I hope that might be something that resonates with others on the webinar. Just to give you a little bit of context, this image of threads within a fabric is something that's become a bit of a metaphor for ESLA Loops and ESLA Loopers, this idea that you don't really know what the extent of the whole fabric will be, and there will be various folds and changes of direction, but within that there will be you can create these cadences of evidence, sense making and adaptive learning, and creating the practice of that is really the essence of what I want to talk about. Just to say also thanks to Morag, because quite a lot of what she set up resonates with what I'm going to talk about in practice. I think creating that collective sense of belonging is critical in learning partnerships. And I'm going to show you a kind of hybrid of examples of where partners have given us the opportunity to kind of test new approaches in practice. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about integrating evidence and experience and go from some headline principles into what that means in practice. I will try to be a little bit provocative, but the provocative comes out of a genuine belief that MEL practice in particular, needs to quite radically change. And what I call traditional MEL is perhaps not set up in the right way to enable people to collaboratively sense make and adaptively learn. And in essence, the evidence is set up and used to write reports rather than to enable people, to bring people together to make sense of evidence and to decide what they should be doing more of, less of, differently. So next slide, please. So a lot of words here, but why is this important? Organizations in the broadest terms are not set up to be adaptive. If as we share this understanding of challenges and contexts are complex, then we need to be adaptive, but we see things as functions. So we have a MEL function, we have a learning function, we have a strategy function, and often they're separate. we see in practice then that people mandate down reporting to partners, to grantees, and then they aggregate and report up to their funders. The bit in the middle is often missing, what that means at an overall portfolio level, and what that means in the context of contributions to intended systems change. In practice, this is a kind of fundamental belief, but complex challenges as how we approach them requires this collaboration across scales, contexts, structures, organizations. And fundamentally, to do that, we need to leverage the experience of those who are closest to the change process. And you're probably starting to get a sense of why I feel uncomfortable calling myself a MEL, in inverted commas, expert, because I don't feel like I'm an expert in any of this. And then finally, we are seeing this broad increase in understanding in systems complexity in organizations, but practice is yet to catch up. So what we do in response to that is still lagging. Next slide, please. So this is the slightly provocative bit. Where does the future lie? Next slide, please. So I think we need to shift fundamentally from generating evidence to support the writing of products to generating evidence. And what I mean by generating evidence is in the right formats and context to support processes and practices. What we need to do as part of that, if we are going to do mandate reporting, we need to make sure that that reporting is useful for the people fundamentally who generate the reporting. I think in the context we're all living with now, there's been an increased recognition that kind of reporting and accountability may be coming back in as a critical kind of function of evidence. But we still need to make sure that whatever we mandate is useful rather than extractive. We need to focus on genuine participation and voice. So those who make sense of the evidence should not be MEL experts. It should be those who have deep insight and experience into the systems and the change process that they're involved in. And I think hopefully some of that will resonate with us MEL practitioners. I've always found it very strange when I'm brought into an organization and having really not known them much before, and then within 3 months I'm supposed to be telling them what they should be doing in the future, sets of recommendations and things like that. I find that distinctly uncomfortable. Briefly, the practice that I will show is demonstrates a small bit of harnessing technology to improve productivity. So that focus on productivity in our methods and to bring people together. So you'll see how we have adopted some use of technology. And then the outcome of all of this has to be about practice. It has to be about using evidence and adaptive learning to enable strategy and foresight. So bringing those functions together into one culture or practice. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so collaborative sense making is the glue that holds this all together. And I will demonstrate a little bit through an example, if we go on to the next slide. But before I do that, just a little bit about what I mean by collaborative sense making. So sense making is the capacity to make sense of the world so you can act in it. The important thing is that we all do this naturally and innately when we're faced with the world in front of us. But organizations can develop the capacity to collectively or collaboratively sense make. So it's about facilitating the process and building the capacity to sense make. And importantly, we believe that those closest to the change and those who hold the deepest insight should be those who are involved in the collaborative sense making. One of my frustrations is when I see terms of reference around participatory evaluations, and what they mean by participatory is the number of interviews you're going to conduct. It's not genuine participation in the most meaningful way. And we believe that by subjecting this evidence to scrutiny in groups, actions are collectively shared and discussed and owned. And therefore, the challenge becomes how you design and facilitate those processes of creating the evidence in the appropriate formats, and then enabling those to make sense of that evidence, and then ultimately to build that sense of collective belonging in becoming a sense-making organization or a sense-making initiative. So it's very much about building capacities and cultures. Okay, right, some practice. So what you see here are two intermediate outcome story templates. Don't worry about reading it. I need to just say thanks to one of our partners, Tom at Clean Air Fund, for enabling us to experiment to a certain extent with generating stories. The headline here is that these stories were not mandated and reported by their partners. They were generated by us. So they were the product of a group interview, some routine reporting that each of the partners provides, and then any other document that they wanted to send us. And with Pedro Prieto Martin, who may be on the call, we used AI to both transcribe and then note taker LM to produce these stories. It took the burden of reporting from the grantee, and we took on that in a semi-automated way. And that enabled us to produce these quite simple but qualitative and narrative explanatory stories. You'll see that they have only 4 fields. So they are naturally quite simple, something around background and context, something around contribution to the systems change, something about the role of the funder's strategy, and something around future directions. So we could generate these relatively efficiently. Next slide, please. What you can then do is bring people together around these groups of stories, and you get that link between individual stories and a portfolio. And you can start to bring different partners together around a collective intent or objective. And again, we start by asking really simple questions. What inspires you? What surprises you? Where do you notice resistance? What questions come up? Okay, next slide. And then what you can start to do is map these stories, intermediate outcomes, against an organization's strategy and portfolio, and you start to see different patterns emerge. As well as having the stories embedded there, you can then bring different groups of people together, and you can start to ask, so there's people at the top, all from different organizations, but with a unified objective or intent. You can start to ask them questions around, where is the work strong? Where are there gaps or challenges? And you can start to harvest some of this in real time. Okay, next slide, please. You can also start to look at the wider landscape. So again, you can bring people together around stories and harvest in real time, ask people different questions. So about enabling dynamics, constraining dynamics, you can do some real-time clustering of those in these breakout groups. You'll start to see that a lot of this is taking evidence from different formats, presenting it in Miro, and then the skills required to facilitate in Miro. Okay, I've got one more section and then I can wrap up. So if you go on to the next slide. So some headline lessons and recommendations. Next slide, please. So this is an illustration that became a bit of a roadmap developed with a colleague called Zand Craig, but I think it illustrates the essence of when this collaborative sense making, this learning practice works. And what you see here is an illustration of, I think, 13 different country teams across Europe within an initiative which is working on green buildings policy. So they have this unified objective or sense of belonging around green buildings policy advocacy, but they're all coming from totally different contexts. And that is one of the settings where this collaborative sense making works incredibly well. People love sharing insights and experience with each other, but you do need that unifying sense of belonging. Okay, so next slide, please. What does this mean in terms of practical lessons and recommendations? The first one I've covered. The second is first experiences are critical. This is often a new process for people, and so you need to start small, you need to keep it simple, and you need to find somebody which I am not, an excellent facilitator. Those people that we need new and different skill sets in the kind of MEL profession, and many of which we don't have. I certainly don't have. We should explore the modest but productive use of AI. And in particular, where it's useful is shifting the emphasis from placing reporting burden on people to enabling their time to be spent in collaborative sense making. We need to demonstrate the practical application. So we need to get away from OECD DAC evaluation criteria, which essentially ask what type of questions, and we need to start asking about how does change happen, and so what are the overall patterns that emerge. Now what should we be doing more of, less of? So fundamentally, we need to look at the practical application of the questions we're asking. And finally, we need to frame the journey. That we have this mantra of from having to sense make to wanting to sense make. And that's when you know you've been successful. It's when you know you can start to leave an organization, when they feel they are a collaborative sense making organization, when that learning partnership or practice is part of what they do. I'll stop there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Robbie. I really enjoyed that. I was struck by something you said that echoed what Morag says, which is taking a leap from learning together to enacting change. So taking all of these data and evidence and learning and using it to actually inform strategy and how the intervention works. I think when you speak about some of the skills that we need on teams, that skill, the facilitation to learn, but also to do the relational work and the influencing to then make change is a critical one that we need to speak about more as practitioners. So thank you for sharing. I am going to open the Q&A. And just to say that in addition to Morag and Robbie, we will have 2 additional contributors to the Q&A session, who I'm going to introduce just now. So Javiera Godoy is a systems practitioner and strategist focused on democratic innovation, collaborative governance, and public sector learning at the Center for Public Impact. Javiera leads regional and global work exploring how governments and communities can reimagine democracy through experimentation, equity, and trust building. She currently anchors the Innovation for Democracy in Latin America Community of Practice, bringing together change makers across the region to strengthen democratic participation. We will also be joined by Raquel Rubio, who's a friend of the Sandbox. He's a researcher, evaluator, and learning practitioner with over a decade of expertise collaborating with philanthropy, local and international civil society organizations to catalyze effective data-driven decision-making. Raquel loves exploring the value of evidence and learning to contribute to emergent solutions and enjoys facilitating collaborative reflection across diverse teams, making data useful, fun, and accessible to everyone. So the first question that I have, I guess, to get us a little bit warm goes to CPI. So bringing Javiera into the chat, which is I was curious to hear a little bit about how you've integrated the insights from the last cohorts of the collective and how you're hoping to build on these to make learning more of that leap, more practical, more useful to teams to change strategy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue, for the question. And I have to say thank you so much to UNDP for this invitation to join, and to Morag and Robbie for such wonderful presentations, and for Raquel joining us today, as well as all the audience. Thank you so much for making this the time and space to be here. I love this question. I think it's something that we've been loving and struggling with as we've been learning at CPI's Collective. And building on what Morag mentioned in terms of lived experience and how our assumptions have been changing, Morag mentioned something about theories of change and how scale and how institutional representation has been something that we've been learning actively from our first pilot. So that's the first thing that I could mention in terms of how we've changed quickly from what we're hearing, listening, and seeing. And how do we embed work that feels change makers can come from different scales, so we can work towards different scales of change as well, from individuals to organizations and so on. That would be the first one that Morag mentioned, but I would like to add 4 other ones, and especially in the context of the Innovation for Democracy cohort for Latin America. So the first thing that we learned is about the importance of this geographical component. There are many complex challenges that we're trying to face globally. And by bringing such a diverse and global cohort, we quickly saw the value in it, and also the challenges of how do you bring that cultural factor that allows us trust building processes to go. Sorry, this is a bit noisy here. And we really believe that geographical focus enhance collaboration. So to us, that meant, okay, let's focus in one area. Let's see if that can help us to build something in Spanish. There's a word that it translates to territory, territorio, that is not about just geographical approaches, but also how all the cultures are in that geography build towards creating a system together. And so that idea of territory was something that we learned really quickly that we had to embed in order to then be global. So we said, in this case, let's start with Latin America with the hopes, and as I shared in the chat, of expanding globally by those learnings. So territory, that geographical focus is the first thing that we saw. We had to like learn and change from that lived experience. I think that also meant delivering this and doing the extra effort of doing it in Spanish. When we say we want to be global, I mean, obviously the most straightforward is to say, we'll do this in English, it's the easiest. But when you do that, you're also closing the doors to so many people that are just brilliant, but maybe don't have the language. So we wanted to just take away that barrier so more people could join and more talents could help us build a collective. I think the third factor here was the time component. We quickly realized that a 4-month learning journey is very hard to achieve. And to build trust, we need, as Morag said, we need time and space to do so. So we extended our timeline to 1 year, hoping that that will not only lead us to like better experiments in terms of like the output itself, but better relationships, to have a sustainable network of connections and people trying to change things together. And maybe the last one was that we learned that live experience is very, obviously it's very important, like that we live all the time, right? Like that's what we do. We live, we have learnings, but how do we do the sense making that Robbie was mentioning here? It's good to combine practice with research. And to that point, to us, that meant bringing an advisor for this cohort, someone who is an expert in innovative democratic. Oh, sorry. This is real life. This is co-working spaces. Innovative and democratic innovations in Latin America. And that expert is helping us in doing that sense making, not only by being with us in those spaces, but also writing and doing everything that happens in between the sessions for us to create that space of trust, but also that good space for experimenting, for connecting things that already exist, and so on. So yeah, a bit long, but that's what we've learned so far.
Thanks, Javiera. And just the last point you were getting to, there's an interesting question, which I think a lot of us practitioners hold from Finola in the Q&A. And I'm, Raquel and Robbie, curious about how you'd go about answering this. So in terms of setting up and getting a collaborative sense-making process going, what does it cost in terms of money? Like, what does it take in terms of resources to get that up and running? It'd be great to hear, you know, your answer to that. And when do you know that you're finished? Are you ever finished? So doing the sense making. Just do you want to, Raquel, maybe do you want to go first and then Robbie?
Yeah, I can jump in. Thank you, Ceci. And I think that's a really great question that we don't touch base on it very often. And that's true that we actually need a lot of resources and time to do this and to do it right. I think learning tends to be an afterthought and tend to be something like, oh, it will be nice, you know, if we get to do some of this learning and use some evidence, blah, 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 blah. And to connect it to Robbie's presentation before, I think we really have to shift that mindset and doing like from the day zero, it has to be organical to all the different areas of an organization or an initiative. It has to really be in the DNA of how we operate. And that obviously has to be translated into budgeting. So giving a specific number, I just don't have it. Obviously depend on how big your initiative it is. My suggestion is like, please stop seeing as oh, then we allocate 10% of the budget, if something very generously to MEL, versus, okay, when I am projecting the budgeting for this initiative and we are thinking that we're gonna do operations or sense making, like incorporate that and acknowledge that people are gonna take resources, time, step backs, right? Because you are opening the space for people to be more, what is emerging, what are we learning and how we respond, versus, oh, I am predicting the future and then controlling that we really don't go out of this gut rate, right? Which it's what I think the development sector has been forced to operate in those lines and has, or we know that that's not effective at all. So I'm really glad that question came in because this costs money and you need to bring external expertise to facilitate. As Robbie said, like it requires different, a very specific set of skills that organizations don't tend to have. And if they do, then you find that you have all the time in the world as the one responsible to bring this about, but then you bring people within your initiative or your team and you can see that they are like, you know, multitasking or really looking for the watch because they want to rush to something else. So everyone has to free up capacity to operate in this way because in the long run, it will pay off for sure.
Add, I don't think it's a hard sell for people. People like to come together and share their experience and their insights. I think where we've had issues before is that convincing people before they actually join that it's worth giving up some of their time and joining meaningfully. And then that mantra I talked about, from having to sense make to wanting to sense make, I think that's when you know you've done your job. Broadly, I think that takes 3 rounds of sense making if you want a kind of rule of thumb. The first is where we've had to come in and kind of lead the facility, co-lead the design of the platforms and the processes, and then lead the facilitation. Round 2, it can be far more of a kind of joint initiative, and definitely by 3rd round, we should be out of there, and that organization should be proudly sense making. That's a quick answer.
Thank you both. And Robbie, maybe you'll type in the chat to Finola, because the second part of her question was, how do you know when you're finished, and avoid getting into rabbit holes and tangents. And I feel that one deeply, Finola. I have a couple of questions for Morag and Javiera. The first one, I think Javiera got into it a little bit in her response, but one of our colleagues wanted to hear how lived experience is factored into or included for some of the topics in the collective and in the process of determining who is in the room for different cohorts. And then we also had a question from Alan, which is kindly put in the chat as well, but he was interested to hear a little bit more about the discomfort of emergence and how the collective handled that, and whether you were able to transform it into the joy and delight of emergence. And note that he loves the collective, great collaborative energy and shared learning.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Alan, for championing us in the background and for bringing in that joy and delight component. I'll touch on that second and first take the first question that you put forward, Sue. I think some of what Javiera mentioned is part of the process of bringing in that lived experience. As she mentioned, really being intentional around how do we design a specific community of practice for the context is really the way that I think about it, the first step in holding the container to then welcome in an array of experiences and relationships to that topic. And then within the actual cohort journey, we go through two processes that I think are really key. The first is designing the purpose of the cohort through developing collaborative learning inquiries. So what do we actually want to learn together? What are our collaborative learning questions? And that really allows that first co-design process to take place, where we start to understand individual participants' vantage points as well as objectives, and find a way to sense make around that and find some level of coherence for the cohort. The second step that we take is to invite participants to develop their own individual learning inquiries, as we call them. So what question do you hold for yourself? What do you want to test around? And that also allows the translation of the work that we do collaboratively together to apply it specifically to your own learning question. How are you testing in your own work and world, and then bringing it back to the wider cohort? So we find that through the design, right, that's one way that we do it. But as I mentioned, there are the different scales of learning as well, right? And one of those scales is that individual component. So really questioning things like, what are the mindsets that are really needed to enact change? It requires you to have a great level of awareness of yourself and those around you. How might you be perpetuating the things that we want to change within the system? As I mentioned, we work with the Caravanserai Collective as an example, and their work that comes in around public narrative also really allows us to go deep in terms of what are the lived experiences in the cohort, and how are we best leveraging those to continue to design the community of practice and our sort of North Star collaboratively. I hope that touches on that question a little bit. And then secondly, when we're thinking about emergence, I think the pendulum swings from complete fear and what are we doing to this is the best thing ever and we're completely filled with joy, or we feel the fire is the way that we describe it. So it absolutely requires you, I mean, speak about sort of the individual experience, right? We really go through the full array of emotions and experiences. And I think it's really necessary to have that level of vulnerability, quite honestly, in order to learn. I think we too often are required to sort of know what we're talking about and know what we're learning, which absolutely goes against the whole point of learning in the first place. So I think embracing emergence has really required us to embrace that vulnerability and really be open with the community of practice as facilitators in that process.
Amazing. Thank you, Morag. We've got a couple of questions for Robbie and Raquel. They're quite chunky though, so I don't know if we'll get to be able to answer them completely at this time. But there's one from Florence who is asking, the collaborative sense-making seems to depend on existing evidence to facilitate learning. What can teams do in times where there is no documented evidence to start the conversation? I think this is learning more towards evidence generation before sense-making. What would you advise teams to consider at that point in the program cycle? And just to add to that, there's this quite provocative one from Guy. Your presentation makes it sound like we aren't really doing any of this, or we aren't doing this well, particularly the need for more trust-building, facilitated learning and informed action, which embodies all of that he currently does. I would argue that techniques such as MSC and outcome harvesting do in fact embody many of the principles and practices you describe. Is this a rebranding of existing practices? If not, please explain. So a bit of a provocative one there. Over to you, Robbie.
Yeah, thanks for both of those, because they are important. The first one, Florence's question, the example I gave there of those stories was exactly that context. It was a funder, an organization that didn't have a deep existing evidence base, particularly an evidence base orientated at the kind of intermediate outcome levels. And I think that orientation, if you can only pick one spot where your evidence should be focused around that kind of intermediate outcome area, that boundary between sphere of control and sphere of influence is where you should orientate. That was where we came in, and we used this productive use of AI to help them create the stories, to free up their time so that they could come into the collaborative sense making together. So there was no evidence base in that context. It kind of links to Guy's point about most significant change and outcome harvesting. The only kind of question I would put back to that is who decides. Traditional delivery of most significant change or outcome harvesting, the evaluation team come in and they even if they co-generate the evidence, it is them that then does the analysis and the synthesis and extracts the lessons and the recommendations. The collaborative sense-making is explicitly about the agency of MEL experts being taken out and becoming facilitators so that those who hold the insight and the experience make sense, and they shape the findings and the future directions, the adaptive learning, rather than it being a MEL expert who decides what the patterns are. I know that there are organizations that are very, very good at their own impact frameworks or whatever they want to call them, and they use most significant change and outcome harvesting, but then do they have that collaborative sense-making practice to use that evidence for adaptive learning? That's the question I suppose I would pose back. Raquel, you may want to add.
Maybe I will just add to the first question in terms of what do we do when we don't have evidence in front of us? Well, we're bringing it back to the learning partnership. When you are in a room full of people, there is already so much knowledge in that room to start with, right? So I think like evidence, the word evidence means a lot of things for a lot of people. Some people need an RCT, some people need a full evaluation report, some people are more comfortable with, okay, what is in our heads right now? So that could be a very valid starting point. Like, what experiences are we bringing to the table? And let's put it in common, let's learn from one another, and let's see what congruencies and incongruencies exist. That's already a fascinating first step that a learning partnership can provide for you. So I would just like drop that there.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our amazing presenters and Q&A guests. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, Fede, for doing the tech behind the scenes and making this run smoothly. We will be posting a blog in soon. We'll be letting you know via email, but also on our LinkedIn group. So please join it and stay in touch. Thank you very much. Bye.